25 years ago, a young debut author seized the limelight and Britain's major first novel award with Oranges Are Not the Only Fruit, a scarifying but also comic story of a girl adopted by a strict, working-class, Pentecostal Christian couple in England's industrial north. Some 18 books and, for the author, half a lifetime later, comes the non-fiction version of that same truly bizarre childhood. Plus, what happened next. It's called Why Be Happy When You Could Be Normal, one of those great titles. And here on the cover is that adopted girl, clutching a beach ball on what for Australians is a recognisably English beach. To me, she looks anxious and uneasy, but maybe that's just because of what we learn inside the book. Let's ask, shall we? Because here with me at the beautiful Mitchell Library is Jeanette Winterson. Jeanette, lovely to be with you. Thank you. What do you remember? Where were you? Can you recall what that girl thought?
There's a mystery to that photograph. It's Blackpool Beach, which is in the north of England, a seaside town, much favoured for holidays for factory workers, one of the famous seaside towns of England. Now, if you look at it, that's 1964, taken by Mrs. Winterson on a box brownie. And this is the busiest seaside town in England. There's nobody there except me.
Yes.
I cannot work this out. I mean, I think we should have a competition for viewers. Why are there no people on Blackpool Beach? So I think the reason I'm looking anxious is that Mrs. Winterson must have dragged us out of bed at 4 o'clock in the morning. It's probably just dawn, and there's not a soul. There's not even a dog.
It was, of course, in more ways than this, a very unusual childhood. I mean, you grew up in a home without no phone, no heater, no fridge, no inside loo. But even more oddly, that you were destined to be a missionary, and you would go around and you would write and give sermons. When did you realise, Jeanette, that this was not the normal childhood?
I don't think I ever did realise. Don't children always think that their own background is normal? I mean, it's different now because we've got globalisation and the internet, TV. People can see other lives very easily. You know, it's one of the reasons why we're all so discontented, because we're always looking at someone else's life, thinking, why haven't I got that? But, you know, if you imagine it in the 60s, where we don't know anything outside of our own environment. You know, I never went further than Blackpool until I went to Oxford when I was 19. You know, and I didn't even know that I could pull over on the freeway to get fuel, because no one had told me. You know, I just loaded up the back of my old car, this old jalopy, with cans and cans of fuel, because I thought I'll never get all the way from Accrington to Oxford in one go. You know, but we were in our own little bubble, and I think people were. I think, you know, there's been such a huge change in the way that we understand ourselves in the world now, that it's quite hard for people, you know, anybody really who's under 40, to understand what it was like to be so isolated and yet think it was completely normal.
But you must have at some stage thought not everyone at your school is going around actually carnival tents giving evangelical speeches.
I did think everybody had a gospel tent. I thought, you know, where's yours? You know, we've got one. I thought they were deprived, you know. I mean, it's not like not having a teddy bear. But, you know, the thing about the Bible and those evangelical religions is the whole message is that you're called to be apart. So you expect to somehow be separate, if not persecuted for your faith. And Mrs. Winterson didn't like anybody anyway. I mean, you know, this was a woman, if somebody knocked at the door, she'd run down the hallway and shove the poker through the letterbox, you know, and you can imagine where it would come out. She was not a welcoming woman. So called to be apart suited her.
She was, I mean, we're talking about Mrs. Winterson, for the few people who haven't read either the memoir or Oranges. This is your adopted mother.
Yes.
She was in all ways an odd woman. Were you scared of her? Were you actually frightened of her?
I wasn't frightened of her. Strangely, I think she was frightened of me, because adoption, when you adopt a child, you really don't know what you're getting. And of course, you know, her strapline was "the devil led us to the wrong crib." And she was always very bitter about that, because she thought somehow she'd been duped by Satan into taking home the wrong child, who was not going to be this glorious daughter and this friend to her that she had imagined, but in fact was just going to be a real load of trouble. You know, because I was clever and smart and I answered back, but also I was cheerful. God knows why, I can't help it. I have a cheerful disposition. And Mrs. Winterson, you know, was a professional misery monger. She was always gloomy. She thought of life as a pre-death experience. You know, and every day she used to stand up and pray, "Lord, let me die," you know, which naturally puts a dampener on the household.
She followed a punishing God. So she was a punishing woman.
Old Testament through and through. You know, she hadn't got to the point where Christ comes and it's all about forgiveness. You know, for her it was all about sacrifice. And she was waiting for the apocalypse. You know, we lived in a kind of end time where she still had her war cupboard, because my parents were much older and they were young people in the war. And she had this cupboard stacked with tins. We still had dried egg and all sorts and condensed milk, you know, with the labels.
In the 1970s?
Oh, yeah. No, right through until she died. She never got rid of the war cupboard because it was for the apocalypse. So she said that when Jesus came back, we'd go and hide under the stairs, eat our way through the tins until we got let into paradise. We used to practice, you know, people have fire drills. Well, we had apocalypse drills where we just go under the stairs, you know, practice eating.
And what happened when you brought friends home from school?
Never did, wasn't allowed to. And that was partly because we had no inside toilet, and she was ashamed of this because she'd married down. She was also a frightful snob, and her own background had been rather more privileged. And she'd married my father, who was working class, couldn't read, as a kind of defiant escape from her family. You know, her father was a womanising thug, but her own mother had been genteel and well-bred. So there was this clash, this collision in her own soul. And so not having an inside bathroom was just absolute shame and embarrassment to her.
Were there redeeming features?
I think so. Partly because I had to set my energy against hers. You know, I think that's why I'm a writer. She was always the one telling some kind of dark narrative. And indeed she did about my biological mother. You know, this was a mother who was dead, who was drunk, who was on drugs, who'd exploded. You know, there were all kinds of stories. And the narratives were so powerful and pervasive that in order to survive, I had to set my own narrative against them, my own stories of myself. And that's how I began to tell stories. You know, and I was often locked out or locked in the coal hole. And the way I survived that was by going inside and finding those riches and those resources. So it seems strange to say that in some ways I don't think I would be a writer, but for those formative experiences which caused me to explore the inner life and not to rely on anything outside of myself.
There's a moment in your story where you've painstakingly collected all these books from the local library, or you've bought them from jobs, because she loved God, but she hated books. Yes. And she burns them. There's a scene of the burning of the books. Yes. That seems to me the lowest moment, was it?
Yes, I think it was. I'd been collecting books and smuggling them into the house secretly and hiding them under my mattress. And of course, if you've got a single bed standard size and a collection of paperbacks standard size, you can fit 74 per layer under the mattress. Because my bed was rising visibly, and she noticed and realised and tugged one out, because it was D.H. Lawrence, Women in Love, terrible choice. And she knew about Lawrence, Satanist, pornographer. And so she just got the whole lot, threw them out of the window and poured the kerosene over them from the little stove, because we had no heating in our house. It's always freezing. And set them on fire. And I'll always remember that, because it was this terribly cold Saturnian January night, and in the middle of it all, this great orange pyramid of flame, and those were my books. And it was really upsetting, because I knew then that anything that is outside of you can be taken away by other people at any moment, and only what's inside of you can be relied upon, which was perhaps a good lesson.
How old were you when you...
That was before I left home, so I was around 14 when that happened.
That's a major perception, isn't it?
Yes.
Does that translate to you can trust only yourself?
No, because I do trust other people, and I think I'm quite good at trusting, strangely, but I don't rely on anything. I always expect to have to fall back on my own resources. And one of the reasons why I memorise text then and now is because if all my books are taken away, and in a forthcoming electronic world, that is a very real possibility in a totalitarian regime. They can just take them all away when they're not in print anymore. If you memorise them, at least the library is inside you, and no one can burn it down, and no one can destroy it.
I don't want to laugh at that, because that's obviously you're saying it very seriously.
Yes.
But do you hear how much like Mrs. Winterson you sound? The apocalypse is coming?
Yeah, well, it probably is. I think with books it might be. I mean, you know, there was that scary thing just recently where everybody downloaded 1984, what a title, and Amazon took it off again. Because
that was frightening.
If that happens once, it can happen. You know, we are moving into a world where control will be out of our hands. And I think that's the true apocalypse, where suddenly all of the things that we took for granted have gradually, step by step, incrementally disappeared. That's the world that worries me with books. Because when the books are on the shelves, anybody can pull them off. You can find them, you can search. You can't have censorship. As soon as it's all electronic, anybody can control that, but it won't be you.
Your book is a bit like a donut with about a 25-year hole in the middle, and the first 2/3 takes you, really basically up to when you escaped from home or were kicked out of home and went to Oxford University. I'd like to talk a bit about that 25-year gap in the middle because it covers the time, really, when you were most celebrated, when your great successful books came out, and also most vilified. And you've said it at that time, which I love, about 1992, I should have had an operation to sew up my mouth and kept it closed till 1997. I went mad and behaved like an idiot. What happened?
Yeah, I'll tell
Do
you.
you remember, we don't follow the London press.
You're very wise not to. Two things happened, I think. One is I had success very young. So I was 24 when Oranges was published. And my career exactly coincided with that of the writer becoming a media personality or a celebrity. Instead of just somebody who sat at home and wrote books, you didn't even know what they looked like. Nobody would ever stop you in the street before then. So it was that whole explosion, evolution of what happened to the world from the mid-80s onwards and made it a very different world. Corporate, self-conscious, globalised, media obsessed, always in the public eye. And writers fared rather badly with that at the beginning because unlike actors or pop stars, we had no PR people with us. Nobody sat down and said, you can't ask that question, or I don't think that's what she meant. We were just fantastic fodder.
So you'd open your mouth and rubbish would come out.
Anything. Well, it was never rubbish. No, it was always provocative. And of course I was. And also I was gay. I was working class. I suddenly made a lot of money. I had a glamorous girlfriend. I was sleeping with Julian Barnes's wife. You can imagine, perfect for the tabloid media. And of course, I was outraged because I wanted to talk about books and literature and the life of the mind, and they wanted to talk about sex and money. So I was always slinging journalists out of the house, slamming the door on them, going round to complain. That
was a famous one I did hear about, where you actually you bowled up to someone's dinner party. Someone had written a note.
Well, I didn't know she was having a dinner party. No. I wasn't invited.
And that went on for weeks.
It went on for
weeks and weeks.
Yeah.
I mean, did you care at the time?
I did care. I've never cared what anybody wrote about my books in a review because that's the public line. You can do what you like. But I've always cared about if the interviews were distorted in some way, and they often were at that time, and genuinely so. So there was a real issue, as well as the fact that I was a fist fighter from the north of England. I wasn't going to have all these Southerners come round and do what they wanted to me. So there was a whole class thing in there as well. And where I come from, you hit out. You don't stand back.
Yeah. And you were growing up, effectively. You were growing up.
I was growing up, and I was growing up in public, and it's a hard thing to do. And also, I'd come from that background. I'd gone through Oxford. I'd had success early. I have nuclear energy. I was this rocket fuel creature, just going to get there, whatever it cost. But at the same time, perhaps I didn't have the sort of self-reflection. But do you before you're 30?
So it wasn't that the fame went to your head. It's just that your nature was not made for this life.
Yeah. No, I was really pleased because it had worked out as it's meant to in the fairy stories. When the third son or the idiot child is the one who finds the treasure, kills the dragon, wins the princess. And I'd read all of that and I thought, hey, that's me. I've got nothing going for me, but I'm going to get the treasure. So when I had success, I simply thought, this is what's meant to happen. I was really pleased because it seemed that, literature was right. So all the stuff that then happened after that also seemed to me like a terrible betrayal, and I thought it was a rejection. I actually thought, why don't you want me? Just like I'd have thought about my mother, and I've had to understand that rejection motif goes very deep, and that you act it out and you see it, in every confrontation. So suddenly the press turning on me and things going wrong, it did feel like, why don't you want me? And I could not. Again. And so naturally I was going to hit out.
Let's go back to your memoir. Because it leaves in the early 80s, like I said, you return in 2008. Not a good time. You've just found your adoption papers. You're just about to attempt suicide. And you're doing a lot of walking around with this hideous voice, this kind of monster in your mind, which you describe as the voice is a cross between Caliban and Mrs. Winterson, which is ugly.
Yes.
Take up that story.
Ugly's the right word. Yes.
How did you get there?
It was a constellation of events, which is what often happens. Obviously, you know, the problem's on the inside, but the trigger's always on the outside. And I'd broken up from my partner, who's a theatre director, Deborah Warner, and we'd been together for 6 years. And it was a very sudden ending, and it was really shocking to me. I loved her. I didn't want it to end. So there was that ordinary unhappiness. And I'd also found papers about my adoption, which suggested to me, A, that my mother might still be alive, B, that I hadn't been adopted straight away by the Wintersons, that I'd been in some sort of institution or orphanage beforehand. C, that I'd had another name, because I found the papers and there was this name violently crossed out, as though someone was trying to hide something. You know, you could see the way, the pressure of the pen on the paper. And then at the bottom, the name of the Adoption Society had been ripped off, you know, not cut, it didn't feel like sanity in that piece of paper. It felt like violence, the rip and the pressure of the pen. And it upset me enormously, and I thought, there's all sorts of things here I don't know anything about, and I thought I would never look into this story. I thought I never needed to. And I began to realise that I would have to, because I wanted to know who this other person was that had been so violently crossed out, this other me, and what my beginnings really were. And I had to confront this deep sadness and increasing loneliness. And I thought, am I never going to be able to make a relationship work? What is the matter with me? You know, do I not know how to love? Will I always get back into the same feeling of just being abandoned? You know, am I always going to repeat this story? I have to do something. So I knew that mentally, but emotionally, of course, I was about to collapse. The floorboards just went from underneath me and I was plunging down into a pit, which I could not stop. And it was a spiral of depression and misery and mental agony. There's nothing you can do. I describe it in the book as living in a haunted house, because some days are fine and you think, oh, okay. And then it's like being hit by an invisible force in the stomach, in the chest. It wins you. It's physical as well as mental. And you double up, you cry out. You know, you wail. I mean, I would sometimes just wail like a dog, like a banshee, like a lost soul in my pain. You know, if I'd been in London, I think they'd have carted me off. Fortunately, I was in the country, so I could do this with some dignity, because God knows you need dignity.
And was it that sense of that this would never be over, the pain would never be over?
You think it will never be over, no. And you think, I cannot live
live
like this. You see, I love life. You know, for all my flaws and problems and mistakes and mess-ups, I do love life. And I thought, if I can't live it full, 100%, you know, the whole of me, then I can't live it at all. I didn't want to be one of those virtual suicides. You know, people who've actually vacated life, although nominally and physically they're still walking around, you know, but they're dead. You look in their eyes and there's nobody home. I didn't want to be that. I didn't want to be on medication, because, you know, we're obsessed with medicalising madness at the moment. You know, we're so scared of people going crazy. We just want to throw the pills at them and get them out of our way. It terrifies us. And I thought, I'm not having that. I knew that it would take time to go mad, and I knew it would take time to get sane. And I was lucky, because I had money in the bank that I'd made myself. And I thought, I can live on that. I can shut myself away. And either this will kill me, or I'm going to get better. And it was 50-50. And I knew that.
I don't want to tell any more about what happened, because I think that's, you describe it in the book, and that's the appropriate way to do it. But my question is, you don't finish the book with that question actually totally resolved. I mean, look at you here, you're fine, but you don't know what happens next, and you make that quite
and that's
clear.
the last line of the book. I have no idea what happens next.
How did you know it was time to write the book then? How did you know? Because it's an ongoing story.
It is an ongoing story, and of course I didn't know it was time to write the book. I was keeping a journal for myself in real time about the detective story of finding my biological mother, Biomar, as I call her. And I had to do that because although I have a good memory, I kept forgetting things because it was obviously releasing some trauma. It's rather like having a deep poison inside you, which you put in a locked box. And if that starts to seep out, it infects the whole self. It is a toxic spill which you've managed to contain all these years, and then you can't contain it anymore. And that's why it makes you mentally and physically ill. And when I was on this search, I felt all the time, I thought I must just use the most rudimentary tools to remember where I am, who I am, and what has happened. So I was keeping a detailed journal, and naturally that made me think again about Winterson World, because all of this stemmed from Mrs. Winterson's crazy stories about what did or didn't happen to me, what was or wasn't true. It's been very difficult to know what was and wasn't true. And that's how the book came to be, not as a conscious act, but as an evolving text.
Mm. And so, will there be further accounts, probably?
Oh, I hope not. I mean, in 25 years, we might both be sitting here with our walking sticks and Zimmer frames, and you'll be saying, "Oh, you've done it again." I'll be
look
saying,
what you did next.
I'm so sorry. But I think maybe I've done it. I think I've said what I had to say for myself and others.
It's a brave thing to say, though. It takes a lot of courage to write about yourself like that. Or, of course, myopia. Was it difficult to decide to share that with the world?
No, it felt necessary. It was an impulse to do it. And after 2 weeks, I'd written 15,000 words. And that tells you there's something going on. It was like a geothermal vent, at the bottom of the sea, which suddenly bursts up. So you've got all this concentrated power. And it had to happen. Sometimes a book writes you, and you must trust that and go with it, which is what I did do. Yes, it did take courage, but maybe courage is something you learn in the coal hole.
Maybe. Let me ask you, a coat of arms. You've once said if you had your own coat of arms, you would have on it a cat, unusual for a dog lover, a coin, a tree, a book, and a hand. It's like one of those Girl Guide games. Tell me why.
Well, I think cats are my favourite animals. I like the way that they're both wild and tame at the same moment. You can't keep a cat. It will come and go, and if it loves you, it will stay, and that's rather like me. And they're liminal. They like threshold spaces, half in, half out, and that's me too. I always have the door open at home until it's actually snowing in, sort of standing joke amongst my friends. And so that
you're a North English girl.
I am a North English girl. So it's that independent creature seems to suit me, and also it was my cat that really saved me, as your readers will find out if they look at the book from the suicide attempt. So that was in there beforehand. So that would be the right creature for me. The coin, because I'm proud that I've earned my own money. And I've earned it not by causing misery to other people, but I hope by bringing sort of pleasure and entertainment as well as maybe some hope to people through my work. The tree, because I love this planet, planet blue, this floating in space, this strange world of ours that we're so intent on destroying, and we won't know what we've lost until it's too late. So that would be for me the canopy, the overarching natural force of the world, the place I want to live. I don't want to live in space. I want to live here. Maybe women are closer to that than men who just want to go off in rocket ships, don't they?
I wouldn't mind going in a rocket ship.
Would you not? Well, but you come back, wouldn't you?
Come back.
They want to go out there and live on rocks with, helmets on and stuff. Then they don't have to relate.
You are typecasting men now.
I am.
The hand.
The hand. That would be two things. It would be writing, which for me is a physical act. I write from my body as well as my head. It's all of me. I'm not cut off from here. It comes from my gut, from my liver, from my energy, from my exercise, and with my hand. I make a lot of notes by hand. And also the hand is the thing, we touch each other. It's how we reach out to one another. It's connection. So it would have to be that.
5 quick questions. The book you reread most often?
Calvino, Invisible Cities.
Because?
It's perfect. It's all about Venice, but it's a long series of short narratives, micro-narratives really, that touch on the whole world but are in fact focused on one place. So it's both liberating and concentrated, and it's not the Anglo-English narrative tradition, which I hate.
It's just been announced that you will be the Professor of Creative Writing at the University of Manchester. If there's one thing you want to get through your students' skulls, what would it be?
Turn up for work every day.
You turned 50 a couple of years back. Did you sail?
How did that happen?
You weren't watching. Did you sail through, or did you have a mortality moment?
I did sail through. But I've had my mortality moment. If you've tried to kill yourself and you don't, then something changes in you forever. What have I got left? 20 years, 30 years? Who knows? But I know what that feels like because I've lived that already as an adult. So this seems to me the most precious thing and the most precious of lives. So that was my mortality moment.
You're collecting early 20th century first editions, I believe. When you're really, really old, what would you do with them? Would you give them to the library, or do you put them back in the market to sell again?
No, I'm giving them to my friend at Shakespeare and Company, Sylvia Whitman, who owns the shop. I've left them to her in my will, and so she will have them all, and what she does with them is up to her.
So from London to Paris?
London to Paris, seems perfect.
And your next book, I hear whispers it's going to be a horror story. Is that so?
So embarrassing. Yes. The guy who's bought the Hammer Horror franchise, which used to do all those crazy films like My Wife the Zombie, it really camped. They got more and more camp as time went on. And just said, look, we're going to do some publishing as well. So would you like to do a novella for Hammer Horror? I thought, this is insane. But I love a challenge. And I thought, well, go on, I'll have a go. And where I come from in the north of England, in Lancashire, was the most famous 17th century witch trial in England ever. And so I was born under Pendle Hill where it all happened. And he said, well, why don't you write about that? So I did.
Oh, you finished it?
Oh, I finished it, yes. It'll be published in August.
I don't think there's one genre you haven't tried yet, is there? You've done kids, you wrote a fitness manual, you've done a horror story, you've written about myths.
Thrillers? No. I don't think I can do that. I don't think I can do that, no.
So you're going to leave the psychological thrillers?
I think I'll leave the psychological thrillers to my friend Ruth Rendell, because she's much better at it than I am.
She's indeed very good at it. Jeanette, it's been so lovely to meet you. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
And that is our program for tonight. Please join me again on the first Tuesday of next month for Regular Book Club. And until then, very happy reading to you. Good night, and good night, Jeanette.
Thank you.